Next is Carlos Santana, who's going to talk about "We Come in Peace," which, as of course you all know, are the worst words you can utter to a Klingon. Oh, and if you have your hand up, please put it down so I don't get confused. Carlos?
Good morning, everyone. Sorry, Kelly, I missed Chelsea's thing because I've been having computer problems, but are we doing like a short introduction?
Yeah, you've got 5 minutes to do whatever kind of introduction you want.
Okay, great. So the work I'm presenting here is also about METI, and my concern is that we're being too nice. My project is working on the assumption, which I'm not sure is actually a good assumption, but the assumption that we've already in some sense announced our presence by sending radio signals into space. And if that's the case, then we might as well decide what message we want to be sending to potential extraterrestrial intelligences. And just for simplicity's sake, let's say the options are to take a relatively peaceful diplomatic stance or to take a sort of more defensive, belligerent diplomatic stance. The question is, which one is going to be less risky for us? Which one is going to be most likely to deter an extraterrestrial intelligence from engaging with us in a way that would be harmful for us? And there's an argument that you see out there, and you definitely see versions of this argument in some of the talks for SSoCIA this time around. Is some idea that in order to be the type of being that would be able to recover and interpret an interstellar message from Earth, a society would have to be at least somewhat cooperative, that it would take cooperative societies to develop the technology and the social cognition in order to interpret an interstellar message. I don't think this is correct. I think that the possibilities for what an extraterrestrial intelligence would look like are much more varied than that. The two major options I raise in the paper are it could be what I'm calling a super individual, which could just be like, say, a very advanced AI or some other sort of organism or being which is not part of society, or it could be a type of society that looks very different than ours. The option I focus on in the paper is a eusocial society. And in either of these cases, you might have advanced cognition and advanced technology that don't require either the ability or inclination to engage in ongoing cooperative behavior with members of another species. And if this is the case, if the possibilities for what extraterrestrial intelligence looks like are more varied, I think that there's a much higher risk that advertising our sort of peacefulness and willingness to cooperate is a bad diplomatic first move. I don't have time to get into all of the details for why, but I basically draw lessons from two things. One is whatever analogies we can have on Earth, which include human history and the way different species interact with each other in nature. And in both cases, sort of taking a more defensive, belligerent posture, I think in general tends to work out better. And then second, thinking in terms of game theoretic modeling, for reasons, again, I'm not going to get into here, I think the right models are not models of sort of ongoing continual interaction like the repeated Pearson dilemma, which is often used to model situations like this, but instead models that are more about infrequent and one-off types of interactions, like the hawk-dove game. And again, in this sort of game, if you have the chance to communicate, the type of communication you should do should be more cautious and less cooperative. So there's a really short version of the talk. Hopefully you're able to watch the video as well, and I'm eager to hear your questions.
Okay, Lucas, I saw you first.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. I am wondering, as an evolutionary theorist, why you think that a super individual or a eusocial entity that was formed by natural selection would not still have the imprint of that natural selection and necessity to cooperate. I'm particularly thinking of facultative eusocial insects. I know less about the obligate eusocial insects, but there's a whole lot of competition and cooperation between reproductive entities in both of those instances.
That's a great question. Thank you, Lucas. So I'll take the easy one first, which is the super individual. The super individual, as I'm thinking of what it is something which perhaps at one point it evolved through natural selection, but at this point its main evolution is through something more like learning or development. So if you think of, say, like a super intelligent AI as an example of this, perhaps there was some way in which the AI at one point went through evolution, but for the most part, it was designed and then it develops through learning and development. And so it wouldn't necessarily have to go through the same sort of evolutionary processes. The eusocial case is a little trickier, right? So you're right. There are lots of eusocial and probably most eusocial insects in some sense have cooperative relationships with other organisms that symbiosis is widespread. You have everything from ants that defend trees to leafcutter ants, and we are all aware of the type of symbiosis that pollinators have with plants and so on, right? And so yeah, that does sort of raise some possibilities for cooperation with eusocial beings. However, the type of cooperation we're thinking about here is a type of cooperation that's more than just symbiosis. Presumably, we won't have symbiosis because we won't share an evolutionary history with extraterrestrial intelligence. Instead, the type of cooperation here is the sort of rational shared interest cooperation that comes about through things like a social contract, right? And this is where the idea that if an alien species is able to recover our messages, it must have something like a social contract, or else it wouldn't have the necessary technology and division of labor in order to recover our message. And there, it may be the case that what eusociality gives an alien society is the necessary sort of social complexity and division of labor to be technologically advanced without giving it something like a social contract, because that social structure and that cooperation is secured by the eusociality itself rather than through a social contract.
Okay, William?
Sure, Carlos. I want to say I also very much enjoyed your talk. If I understand correctly, your stance is that we should take a belligerent posture if we're going to signal at all. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, but belligerent, not in the belligerently defensive. It would be probably the best way to put it.
All right. Now, Lucas was asking sort of from an evolutionary biology standpoint. I want to ask about your sort of second thread, which is comparative history. And I'm not a comparative historian, right? So, but I am of Filipino heritage, and I was born in the United States, and I'm very much American as well. So I'd like to think about what happened in the Philippines, which is now called the Philippines because of a Spanish king, when Magellan landed there and was killed by Lapu-Lapu and never actually completed the circumnavigation of the Earth. It was clear, right, that the Filipinos, within a few weeks, decided that they wanted to resist Magellan, and they therefore fought back, and it didn't go well for them. In fact, it seems to me that it might not have gone well for them no matter what once they had been discovered by the European world. So I guess I'm asking a question, which is to say, not being a comparative historian, but knowing at least one example where taking a belligerent stance did not help at all and potentially harmed. Why is it that we should take this kind of attitude towards messaging?
No, that's a good point. And so, here's what I want to say as someone who is not a historian, at least not a historian of this sort of thing, but has tried to do a bunch of reading on how this happened during the age of colonialism. Like, the fact of the matter is, whatever you did, it didn't go well for you as an indigenous group, right, during colonialism. However, and I'm most familiar with the sort of American context. That's in the written version of the paper. That's mostly the sort of work by historians that I draw on is on the American context. While it didn't go well for you no matter what, a lot of the reasons why it didn't go well for you no matter what had to do with disease as much as anything else. And indigenous groups who just sort of like welcomed whoever it was, the Spanish or the English, with open arms, they tended to sort of retain their independence for not nearly as long as groups who resisted. Groups who actively resisted, think groups like the Apache and the Mapuche, who are more belligerent, they often retained autonomy well into the 19th century. I see Robert's raising a book.
Sorry, I'd like to follow up just a little bit. So I'd like to think about this not only in the context of first contact, that moment of first contact, but what the long view is going to be. A generational or a century or millennial view of what's going to happen. And I think that it does make a difference what happens in first contact, in the sense that it's going to influence the way the indigenous culture thinks about itself and how it was colonized, and the manner in which it was colonized, right? So I think it's a very complex and interesting issue. I don't know enough about it, and I hope that there is some expertise somewhere in our group or beyond that can make that comparative historical argument.
Yeah, so let me answer your follow-up, because you're right. There's a lot here, and this is something that in the video I basically didn't touch on at all. It deserves to be touched on. So the Aztecs, I think, are a great example, and they're the example I get into the most. But just to acknowledge what everyone is putting in the chat and raising books up and things like that. But let me say this about the long view, and I think even the Philippines are a good example here, is there was armed Philippines resistance to even American occupation in the 20th century. There was a lot of armed resistance. And
there was, and we were tortured for that. Absolutely.
Oh yeah. And Filipinos paid a huge price for that. However, if you look at, at the colonies which America took in the Spanish-American War, which one has its independence, right? The one that paid the cost of being belligerent.
Okay, Eric, I'm sorry, Eric Pearson.
Yes, thanks for an interesting take on this issue, Carlos. My issue here is, like, if I was receiving a message from another civilization, and I got a message that was telling me that these guys, they don't have a lot of high-tech weapons and they're pretty docile, then I would probably leave them alone. But if I get a message saying that these guys, they have some weapons, but they don't have interstellar weapon capacity yet, but they have some weapons, and they seem to be pretty aggressive guys, and they can probably be a nuisance in the future. So I guess the most rational thing to do then would be to say that let's get rid of them now before they get interstellar capacities. What do you think of that response?
Yeah, so here's the way I think of that analogy is if it's not right in my own backyard, is it rational for me to go around hunting down a much less advanced organism which would only have potential of giving me harm if it somehow became more advanced or somehow ended up right in my near vicinity? Is it worth it for me to go hunt down all of the skunks that live in the mountains nearby, right? A skunk has weapons much less advanced than mine, is much less intelligence than me, though it can make my life pretty miserable for a little while if I sort of interact with one in my own backyard. And the answer is, even though in some ways dealing with a skunk is just an inconvenience, or dealing with a wasp hive is an inconvenience, going out of my way to just destroy a skunk or a wasp hive because it might end up, or one of its descendants might end up in my backyard, causing me an harm or inconvenience, that's not actually a rational thing to do. That the fact that you have organisms like, say, skunks or wasps, which are pretty willing to advertise their ability to cause you minor harm or inconvenience if you go into their backyard and harass them, that actually turns out to be a pretty effective deterrent. And I think the same thing is probably going to be true for an extraterrestrial intelligence. Like, so if you're worried one that's so advanced that we would stand no chance in any sort of fight with it, and at best would be a minor inconvenience, we're sort of in the position of that skunk. Like, it's likely, even given highly advanced technology, it would still be going out of its way to send a weapon or across the vast distances of space or so on. It would be incurring a cost to do so, and it's probably not worth incurring that cost if it's not immediately threatened by the minor inconvenience. Your people are pointing out about, say, the murder hornets. It's different if what you're threatened with is something which can cause you more than a minor inconvenience and which is spreading. So if what we were advertising was something like, we're going to go around, start traveling around the galaxy and being belligerent, that's very different than saying we are going to be defensively belligerent.
Okay, we're down to 2 minutes. Eric Hughes.
Sorry, I wasn't hot on the unmute button. I found there was a lot of argument about why various other actors would behave in a certain way, but I found it all incomplete in the sense that you don't resolve down to payoff matrices to justify the stance in terms of a game theory analysis, which would seem to be possible with what your argument is making.
Yeah, that's just something I didn't really have time for if I wanted to lay everything out in a 15-minute video. And the game theory here is not particularly complicated. Basically, if you want the game theory to be a little more complicated, I argue for why we should think of this more like a hawk-dove game, or a game of chicken, which is a variant of the hawk-dove game where you can't.
Actually, I think the game theory is quite complicated, because we're probably operating near a critical point of the game theoretic space, and you have to talk about uncertainty and noise in a very cogent way, which is not generally what game theory has been doing.
Yeah, good. So you can't just assign numbers. We don't know what numbers you would assign as payoffs. That's right. Which is so all I do in the paper is I leave things at saying, I think that this is likely the type of game that it would be, without being able to assign particular payoffs, and say this is the type of strategic move that we should probably make if this is the type of game that we're involved in, and argue that strategic move supports my argument. So you're right. The game theoretic argument here can't be very precise. In a lot of ways, because of all the uncertainties here, everything has to just sort of be, here are some reasons that are insecure, and I'm just going to throw a bunch of different reasons at you for why this is the right answer when it comes to issues surrounding METI. And I don't think anyone can do any better, given all the uncertainties here.
Well, the one thing that you could be doing is to illustrate a toy game theoretic model which does justify the strategy you're taking about, to point out an example in the configuration space of where the strategy is optimal.
Okay, so unfortunately, we're going to have to end it here. I know that's frustrating, but think of it this way: that's success, because there's so many questions we don't have time to answer them all, even though we have more time devoted to discussion than normal.